I'm standing at my sister Emily's wedding in my military dress uniform, watching her live the perfect life I helped pay for. She doesn't know I paid for half this wedding. She doesn't know I raised her while our parents fought. She doesn't even know my real job. When she sees me, her face twists with that familiar contempt. "So still pushing papers at some desk, Vanessa?" She says it loud enough for the whole table to hear. Everyone laughs. I'm the family joke, the spinster, older sister, 36, and alone. I smile. "Actually, Emily, I fly helicopters. Combat rescue." She rolls her eyes drunk on champagne and attention. "Oh, right. What's your tough girl call sign then?" "Iron Widow." The room continues chattering, but her groom Ethan, a Navy SEAL I've never met, goes completely still. His face drains of color. He stares at me like he's seen a ghost. Then he stands up, walks to Emily, and does something that makes the entire reception freeze. "Apologize," he says, his voice cold as death. "Now." Because Ethan knows exactly who Iron Widow is. He knows what I did 8 years ago in Afghanistan. He knows the debt he owes me, a debt that has everything to do with his brother, a secret mission, and the woman who flew into hell to bring his team home. This is the story of how my sister's perfect wedding became the day her entire world collapsed, and how the man she married chose me over her without saying a single word. Stay with me, because what happens next will destroy everything. My name is Vanessa Mitchell. I'm 36 years old, a former Army helicopter pilot who spent 15 years flying combat rescue missions in places most people can't find on a map. I saved lives for a living, pulled wounded soldiers out of hell while bullets pinged off my aircraft. Now I work for a private medical transport company flying organ donations and critical patients between hospitals. It's quieter work, but it still matters. At least that's what I tell myself on the days when I wonder if anyone actually notices what I do. Today, standing outside the gilded doors of the Riverside Grand Hotel, watching my younger sister Emily marry a man I've never met, I'm reminded once again that in my family, I've always been invisible. The moment I step into the reception hall, I know I don't belong here. The venue is something out of a magazine, crystal chandeliers catching the afternoon light, ivory roses cascading from every surface, tables draped in champagne-colored silk. There must be 200 guests filling the space with animated conversation and laughter. I recognize some faces from childhood distant aunts, family friends who stopped asking about me years ago, but no one breaks from their clusters to greet me. I'm just Emily's older sister, the one who moved away and only comes home for obligatory events like this. The one who chose a career over a family, or so they've always assumed. I make my way to my assigned table in the back corner as far from the head table as possible, without actually being in the kitchen. My mother's work, no doubt. She seated me where I wouldn't be visible in the wedding photos, wouldn't accidentally draw focus from Emily's big day. I'm wearing my army dress blues, not because I want attention, but because it's the only formal outfit I own. After years of living out of duffel bags and spending my money on my parents' bills and Emily's emergencies, I never got around to buying cocktail dresses. The uniform feels right anyway, like armor. It reminds me that I have value, even if my family forgot. As I settle into my chair and accept a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, I hear them. The whispers. They're not even trying to be subtle. 2 women at the next table, both wearing tasteful pearls and judgment. That's Emily's older sister, the one in the military. What was her name again? The other woman responds, Vanessa, I think. Still single at 36. Must be married to her job. Such a shame she was so pretty when she was younger. They don't know I can hear them, or maybe they don't care. I take a slow sip of champagne and keep my face neutral. Years of military discipline taught me how to hide what I'm feeling, how to stay calm when people underestimate you. The truth is, their words do sting, but they're nothing I haven't heard before. My mother says the same things, just more politely. Vanessa, when are you going to settle down? Don't you want children before it's too late? Emily's getting married. Doesn't that make you feel like you're missing out? As if marriage were the only measure of a woman's worth. As if I hadn't spent the last 15 years proving my value in ways they could never understand. Across the room, Emily glows. She's always been beautiful. Delicate features, long blonde hair, the kind of effortless grace that makes people want to take care of her. Today, in her fitted white gown with its cathedral train, she looks like a princess. Our parents stand on either side of her, beaming with pride. My father has his arm around her shoulders. My mother is dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, overcome with joy. I watch them and feel that familiar hollow ache in my chest. When I graduated from flight school, top of my class, my father said, "That's nice, Vanessa," and went back to reading his newspaper. When I received a commendation for valor after pulling 6 soldiers out of an active combat zone, my mother asked if the award came with a pay raise. But when Emily got engaged to a man she'd known for 8 months, they threw a party and invited everyone they'd ever met. I'm not bitter. At least I tell myself I'm not. Emily and I are just different. She needed our parents' love and attention to survive. I learned early that I'd have to earn everything on my own. That's fine. I made peace with it years ago. Or I thought I did until today, sitting alone at this wedding watching my family celebrate a daughter they actually see. Then I feel it, a gaze heavy and intent. I glance up and find him staring at me. The groom. Ethan. I've only seen him in photos Emily posted on social media, smiling next to her at beaches and restaurants, always looking polished and confident. In person, he's more striking. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that comes from years of military training. He's wearing his navy dress, whites, ribbons, and insignia, marking him as someone who's seen serious action. A SEAL, Emily told me proudly on the phone. He's a real hero, Vanessa. Not like, well, you know what I mean. But right now, he's not looking at Emily. He's looking at me. Our eyes meet across the crowded room, and something passes between us, something I can't name. It's not attraction, though he's handsome. It's not curiosity, though we've never met. It's something deeper, more unsettling. Recognition. As if he knows me, though I'm certain we've never crossed paths. His gaze is intense, almost analytical, the way a soldier assesses a situation. I notice a small tattoo on his wrist, partially visible beneath his uniform cuff. A trident, maybe, or another military insignia. I can't make it out from this distance. The moment stretches. Then someone calls his name, and he turns away, pulled back into the celebration, but the feeling remains. My skin prickles with unease. Why would Emily's groom look at me like that, like he's solving a puzzle? Like I matter? I drain my champagne and set the glass down with more force than I intend. Around me, guests laugh and toast and celebrate. The DJ starts playing something upbeat. Emily dances with our father, both of them glowing. And I sit alone in the back, wearing my uniform like a shield, wondering why I came at all. And that look like he already knew me haunted me the whole night. Sitting at that wedding table, watching Ethan's eyes linger on me with that strange recognition, I'm pulled back to a memory I've spent years trying to forget. I was 12 years old, standing in our cramped kitchen, holding my report card like a trophy. 6 subjects, 6 A's. Perfect scores in everything. I'd stayed up late every night for weeks, studied until my eyes burned, determined to make my parents proud. My father sat at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper, coffee cooling in his mug. I placed the report card in front of him, my heart hammering with anticipation. He glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds, nodded once, and said, "That's what we expect from you, Vanessa." Then he went back to his paper. No smile, no congratulations. Just expectation, as if excellence were my baseline obligation rather than an achievement. 2 days later, Emily came home with her report card. She was 8, still in elementary school, and she'd gotten a B+ in math. Just 1 B+ surrounded by C's and a single A in art. My mother saw it and actually squealed with delight. "Emily, you brought your math grade up. Oh, sweetheart, we're so proud of you." Within an hour, my mother was on the phone inviting relatives over for a celebration dinner. That weekend we had Emily's favorite meal, lasagna garlic bread and chocolate cake, all because she'd managed to scrape together a B+. I sat at that table pushing food around my plate and understood something fundamental about my place in this family. Emily was celebrated for trying. I was only noticed when I failed. The pattern repeated itself in countless ways over the years. When Emily made the cheerleading squad after 3 attempts, my parents bought her new pom-poms and threw a party. When I won the regional science fair, my father asked if the prize money would help pay for Emily's cheer uniform. When Emily got asked to homecoming by a boy she'd been crushing on, my mother cried happy tears and took her dress shopping. When I was accepted into a prestigious summer aviation program for high school students interested in military careers, my mother said, "That's nice, dear. But can you still babysit Emily while we're at the lake house that week?" I learned to make myself small, to tuck my accomplishments into corners where they wouldn't take up space that belonged to Emily. I became the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who could be counted on to manage herself while everyone else managed Emily. The worst part wasn't the lack of praise. It was the fact that I became Emily's caretaker without anyone ever asking if I wanted the job. Our parents fought constantly about money, about my father's long hours at work, about my mother's spending about everything and nothing. Their arguments would erupt after dinner, voices rising until the walls seemed to shake. Emily would run to her room crying, and I would follow. I'd sit on her bed and hold her while she sobbed into my shoulder, stroking her hair and telling her everything would be okay. I was the one who helped her with homework when our parents were too distracted. I was the one who made her breakfast when our mother couldn't get out of bed after a particularly bad fight. I was the one who checked under her bed for monsters and promised her that families fought sometimes, but it didn't mean they didn't love each other. My mother would collapse in the living room weeping about how hard her life was, how she never imagined marriage would be this difficult. My father would storm out, slamming the door so hard the pictures rattled on the walls. And I would wait until Emily fell asleep, then go downstairs and clean up the emotional wreckage. I'd make tea for my mother, sit with her while she cried, listen to her complaints about my father. I'd pick up whatever had been thrown during the argument, put the furniture back in place, restore order to the chaos. I was 12 then, 13, then 14, playing therapist and mediator and parent to my own parents. Emily never had to do any of it. She only knew how to fall apart and be held. She never learned how to hold anyone else because I was always there to catch her. By the time I was 18, I was exhausted. Exhausted from being invisible. Exhausted from holding everyone together while no one held me. I'd already decided I was joining the army, that I was going to flight school, that I was going to build a life where my value wasn't measured by how well I served everyone else's needs. The night I told my parents, we were sitting at that same kitchen table where my report card had been dismissed years earlier. I'd rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd explain that I needed this, that I'd found my calling, that I wanted to serve something bigger than myself. My father's face turned red before I even finished my first sentence. "The military!" he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You want to abandon this family to go play soldier? That's the most selfish thing I've ever heard." My mother started crying immediately. Not the dignified tears she'd shed at Emily's cheerleading tryouts, but harsh, accusatory sobs. "How could you do this to us, Vanessa? We need you here. Emily needs you. You're running away from your responsibilities." Emily, 14 by then, and more interested in her phone than the conversation, looked up just long enough to ask, "Does this mean you won't be at my graduation?" Not, "Are you sure this is what you want?" Not, "Will you be safe?" Just concern about how my absence would affect her special day still 4 years away. I left for basic training 2 months later. My father didn't say goodbye. He looked through me like I'd already ceased to exist. That was the day my father stopped calling me his daughter. The years that followed my enlistment taught me how to survive without my family's approval. I learned to find value in mission success rather than parental pride in the lives I saved, rather than the recognition I never received. But sitting at Emily's wedding reception, watching her bask in the spotlight while I occupied my corner table in the shadows, I realized that some wounds never fully heal. They just learn to stay quiet until someone presses on them hard enough. The dinner service had finished, and guests were settling into that pleasant buzz of champagne and conversation when Emily stood up. She wobbled slightly, steadying herself on the edge of the head table, her cheeks flushed pink from alcohol and excitement. Someone handed her a microphone. The DJ lowered the music. The room fell into expectant silence, all eyes turning toward the radiant bride. Emily loved moments like this, always had. Even as a child, she'd find ways to gather an audience to make sure every eye in the room was watching her. Today was her masterpiece, the culmination of everything she'd ever wanted. She started with the usual wedding speech gratitude. Thank you to her parents for this beautiful day, for their endless love and support. Thank you to her bridesmaids for being her rocks, her best friends, her chosen sisters. Thank you to Ethan's family for welcoming her with open arms. She was good at this, I had to admit. Her voice carried that perfect blend of emotion and poise, making everyone feel included in her happiness. People dabbed at their eyes. My mother was outright crying again. My father beamed with pride. This was Emily at her best, the golden child everyone adored. Then her gaze found me in the back corner, and something shifted in her expression. A flicker of something I'd seen before, that need to establish hierarchy to remind everyone of their place in her world. She smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the smile of someone who'd had just enough champagne to say what she really thought, emboldened by having an audience that would laugh at anything she said. And of course, she continued, her voice taking on a teasing lilt that made my stomach tighten, I have to thank my big sister Vanessa for being here. She's so busy with her very important military career. She paused for effect, letting the words hang in the air. Everyone, my sister is a desk warrior for the military. She pushes papers somewhere safe while the real heroes do the fighting. She raised her glass in a mock toast, her smile wide and bright as if she'd just made the cleverest joke in the world. The laughter hit me like a physical blow. It erupted from tables all around the room, guests chuckling and nodding as if Emily had said something charming rather than cruel. I felt my face flush, hot blood rushing to my cheeks in that involuntary response to humiliation I'd never quite mastered controlling. Some guests glanced at my uniform with confusion, clearly wondering why I'd wear military dress blues if I just had a desk job. But most simply laughed along because Emily was the bride, and brides are supposed to be delightful. A few people at nearby tables looked at me with something between pity and amusement, the same look I'd seen my whole life. Poor Vanessa. So serious. Can't even take a joke at her sister's wedding. I could have stayed silent. I could have smiled and nodded and let it pass the way I'd let 1,000 other dismissals pass over the years. I could have shrunk back into my corner and disappeared, which is what everyone expected me to do. But something in me, maybe the memory of that 18-year-old girl who'd walked away from her father's rejection, maybe the pilot who'd flown into hell and brought people home, maybe just exhaustion from being invisible, refused to be erased this time. I set down my champagne glass carefully and spoke. My voice came out steady, calm, carrying the same tone I used over the radio during extractions when everything was chaos and fire, and I needed my crew to trust me completely. I fly helicopters, Emily. Combat rescue missions. The laughter died in awkward patches like a wave losing momentum. Conversations faltered. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, beginning to realize that Emily hadn't been joking about something funny, she'd been mocking something real. A few people who'd served or had family in the military looked at me with dawning recognition and respect. An older man in a veteran's cap 2 tables over stopped mid-laugh and sat back in his chair, his expression sobering. The mood in the room changed, though not everyone understood why yet. But Emily, drunk on attention and champagne, couldn't read the shift. She rolled her eyes dramatically, playing to her audience committed to the bit. Sure, Vanessa, whatever you say. She waved her hand dismissively, a gesture that said, we all know you're exaggerating, and turned back to the crowd with a bright smile, ready to move on to more important thank yous. The damage was done. She'd gotten her laugh. She'd reminded everyone that I was the serious, boring sister, the one who couldn't quite measure up to her sparkle. She'd made herself shine brighter by dimming me, and it had worked just like it always worked. I felt that familiar ache settle in my chest, the one I'd carried since childhood. The ache of being diminished by the very person I'd spent my life protecting. I'd held Emily when she cried. I'd sacrificed my own needs to keep her safe. I'd sent money home to help pay for her college when our parents couldn't afford it. I'd missed her high school graduation because I was deployed, and she'd never forgiven me for it, never mind that I was saving lives while she walked across a stage. And this was my reward. Public mockery at her wedding. A reminder that my sacrifices meant nothing, that I would always be the shadow to her light. Across the room, I saw Ethan's face change. He'd been smiling along with everyone else during Emily's speech, the proud groom enjoying his bride's moment. But when I said I flew helicopters, when I said combat rescue, his expression shifted like someone had flipped a switch. His posture went rigid, military straight. His jaw tightened, muscles working beneath his skin. He stared at me with an intensity that made the air feel thin, as if he were trying to see through me, past me, into something he couldn't quite believe. His hands gripped the edge of the head table so hard his knuckles went white. Guests sitting near him noticed the change, glancing at him with confused concern, but he didn't seem to see them. He only saw me. Emily continued her speech, oblivious to her groom's sudden tension, basking in the applause and laughter her little joke had earned. I reached for my purse, ready to leave as quietly as I'd arrived, to slip out the back and drive home and forget I'd ever come. This was a mistake. I should have known better than to expect anything different. But then someone at a nearby table, one of Ethan's military friends, judging by his haircut and bearing, leaned over and asked loud enough for others to hear, "Wait, you're Army Aviation, what's your call sign?" I hesitated. Call signs weren't something you advertised to civilians. They were earned in combat, given by your unit, and they carried weight in military circles. Mine carried more weight than most. But I was tired of being invisible, tired of letting Emily rewrite who I was to make herself feel bigger. So I looked directly at Ethan, not at the man who'd asked the question, and I told the truth. And then I told them my call sign, Iron Widow. The words left my mouth quietly directed at the man who'd asked, but in the strange acoustic pocket between Emily's speech ending and the next round of applause, my voice carried further than I intended. Iron Widow. 2 words that meant nothing to most people in this room, but everything to a specific few. I watched those 2 words ripple through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water, and I saw the exact moment they reached the people who understood what they meant. An older man 3 tables away went completely still. He was maybe 70, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit anymore, and a Marine Corps veteran's cap he probably wore everywhere. His wineglass stopped halfway to his lips. His eyes locked onto me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Then, slowly and deliberately, he set down his glass and stood up. The movement was stiff, arthritic, but purposeful. He began to clap. Not the enthusiastic applause of a wedding guest, but slow measured, each clap distinct and weighted with meaning. The sound cut through the ambient chatter like a drumbeat. A woman near the bar, maybe 50, wearing a Navy veteran's pin on her dress, turned sharply at the sound. Her hand flew to her mouth. She stood too, joining the Marines' applause. Then a younger man in his 30s, built like he still hit the gym every day, rose from his seat near the dance floor. He had that unmistakable military bearing, the kind that never fully leaves even years after discharge. He clapped harder, faster, and others around him looked confused but began to join in, not understanding why, but sensing something significant was happening. Within 30 seconds, a dozen people were standing and applauding, and the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted from celebration of a bride to recognition of something far bigger. Emily's face went from glowing to confused to irritated in rapid succession. She was still standing at the head table, microphone in hand, and suddenly no one was looking at her anymore. They were looking at me, and worse, they were applauding me. She tried to laugh, a bright, tinkling sound that she'd perfected over years of deflecting uncomfortable moments. "Well, that's quite a response for a call sign," she said into the microphone, attempting to sound amused rather than threatened. "I guess everyone loves a good nickname." But her joke fell flat. The applause continued building now as more people stood, some who didn't know why, but felt the pull of collective emotion, others who clearly served or had family who served and understood that Iron Widow wasn't just a nickname. It was a legend whispered in certain circles, a pilot who'd done the impossible when no one else would fly. Then Ethan moved. The sound of his chair scraping against the polished floor was harsh and loud, cutting through even the applause. The room fell silent so abruptly, it felt like someone had pressed a mute button. Every eye turned to him. He stood at the head table in his dress whites, ribbons, and medals arranged in perfect rows across his chest, and his face held an expression I couldn't quite read. Not anger, not joy. Something deeper and more complex, like he'd just solved a puzzle that had been haunting him for years. Without a word, without even glancing at Emily, he stepped down from the elevated head table and began walking toward me. The crowd parted instinctively. Guests moved their chairs back, creating a pathway between us. I heard whispers starting confused murmurs about what was happening, why the groom was leaving his bride during her moment. My heart hammered in my chest. Part of me wanted to sit back down to make myself small again, to let this moment pass. But I'd spent too many years making myself small. So I stayed standing, my hands clasped in front of me, watching this Navy SEAL cross the reception hall with the kind of focus and intensity I recognized from my own combat experience. This was a man on a mission. He stopped directly in front of my table, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to notice the small scar above his left eyebrow. Then in one fluid motion that spoke of thousands of hours of training and discipline, he brought his hand up in a formal military salute. It was perfect textbook, the kind of salute you render to a superior officer, or someone who's earned the highest respect. His back straight, his eyes locked on mine, his entire bearing communicating honor and gratitude. "Thank you for your service, ma'am," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of that silent room. There was something in his tone that made my throat tighten. Something raw and genuine that had nothing to do with wedding day politeness and everything to do with something real and earned and true. I hadn't been saluted in years. Since leaving active duty, I'd existed in the civilian world where my service was background information, a fact people nodded at politely before changing the subject. But this salute reached something deep inside me, something I'd protected and hidden away. My body responded before my mind caught up. I snapped to attention, muscle memory taking over, and returned his salute with the same precision and respect. For a moment we stood there, two veterans acknowledging each other in the language we'd both learned in service to something bigger than ourselves. Then the room exploded. The applause that had started uncertainly now roared to life with genuine feeling. People surged to their feet, some wiping their eyes, others smiling with that fierce pride people feel when they witness something authentically honorable. Phone cameras appeared recording this moment that had somehow become more memorable than any planned wedding tradition. The older Marine was crying openly, still clapping. The woman with the Navy pin had her hand over her heart. Even guests who'd never served seemed moved by something they couldn't quite name but recognized as important. I dropped my salute, suddenly overwhelmed and uncertain. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low enough that only I could hear over the applause. "Helmand Province, August 2017. You flew into an ambush to extract a SEAL team. You saved 6 men that day, including my brother David." His eyes were wet. "He died 3 months later in another op, but he lived long enough to tell me about the voice on the radio who stayed calm when everything was on fire, who promised she'd bring them home and did. He called you Iron Widow." My knees went weak. Helmand Province. I remembered. Of course I remembered. You don't forget missions like that, the kind where you're flying through tracer fire and your co-pilot is screaming and you're running calculations in your head about whether your bird can take one more hit. I'd pulled 6 men off that ridge, so shot up with adrenaline I didn't realize I'd been grazed by shrapnel until we landed. But I never knew their names. You usually don't in combat rescue. They're just coordinates and voices and bodies you load into your helicopter and pray you can keep alive long enough to reach the hospital. I looked past Ethan to the head table where Emily stood frozen, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Pale white to flushed red, confusion to understanding to pure rage. Her hands trembled at her sides, one still clutching the microphone she'd forgotten she was holding. This was her wedding, her carefully orchestrated day where she was supposed to be the center of every photograph, every memory, every story people would tell afterward. But the applause wasn't for her. The phone's recording weren't capturing her. The moment everyone would remember from Emily's wedding wasn't the first kiss or the first dance. It was this, her groom saluting her sister. The sister she'd just publicly mocked. The sister she'd spent a lifetime trying to diminish. She tried to smile, tried to lift her hands to join the applause, but they shook so badly she had to clasp them together. A bridesmaid touched her arm, saying something I couldn't hear. My mother looked stricken, torn between pride in me and horror at Emily's obvious distress. My father's face was unreadable, but he wasn't clapping. Ethan still hadn't returned to Emily's side. He remained near me, and I realized he was speaking again, telling me something about his brother's journal about a promise he'd made. That moment of respect echoed longer than any applause, and it broke something in Emily forever. I left the reception shortly after Ethan's salute slipping out while guests were still processing what they'd witnessed. I didn't say goodbye to Emily or my parents. I just wanted to get home to the quiet sanctuary of my apartment, where no one was watching me, where I could breathe without feeling the weight of expectation or judgment. I drove the 2 hours back to my place in silence, windows down, letting the night air clear my head. By the time I pulled into my parking spot, I'd almost convinced myself that the evening would fade into family history, just another uncomfortable Mitchell family gathering that we'd all pretend never happened. I was wrong. I woke up the next morning to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. My phone was vibrating continuously, notifications piling up so fast I couldn't read them. Confused and still groggy, I opened my messages to find links from people I hadn't spoken to in years, from old army buddies, from distant relatives, even from my apartment building's management office. Every link led to the same thing: video footage of last night. Someone had recorded Ethan's salute, and that someone had posted it online. Within hours, it had spread like wildfire across every social media platform I didn't use and couldn't control. The video was everywhere. On TikTok, it had been set to dramatic music and already accumulated 3 million views. On Twitter, it was accompanied by threads dissecting every detail, praising Ethan's gesture and condemning Emily's mockery. Instagram Reels showed the moment from multiple angles, guests' cell phones having captured the scene from different positions around the room. Facebook was perhaps worse, with the video being shared in military family groups, veteran support pages, and general interest communities where people who knew nothing about either of us felt entitled to comment on our entire lives. The most popular version, the one that kept getting reposted, had a caption that made my stomach turn: "Navy SEAL salutes sister-in-law at wedding after bride mocks her service. Watch her face." The comments were relentless. Thousands of them from strangers who felt they knew me, knew Emily, knew everything about our family dynamic from a 2-minute clip. This is what real respect looks like. The bride's face, though, followed by a skull emoji that apparently signified death by embarrassment. Find you someone who respects you, like this SEAL respects Iron Widow. That sister is seething, may you. Imagine mocking a literal war hero at your own wedding. The comments about Emily were vicious, transforming her into an internet villain, a meme called the jealous bride, that people used to illustrate pettiness and insecurity. Screenshots of her frozen expression, her flushed face, her trembling hands were being shared with cruel captions and laugh reactions. By afternoon, legitimate news outlets had picked up the story. I saw headlines I never wanted to see: "Groom honors war hero sister-in-law, overshadows bride at wedding reception." Viral video shows Navy SEALs touching tribute to Army pilot who saved his brother. Someone had dug into my military records, which should have been private, but apparently weren't private enough. Articles detailed my 15 years of service, my deployment history, the commendations I'd received, the missions I'd flown. My call sign, Iron Widow, became public knowledge. A military blog ran a piece titled, "The Legend of Iron Widow, the Pilot Who Flew into Hell," interviewing anonymous sources from my old unit who shared stories I'd never told anyone outside the military. I was being held up as a symbol of quiet heroism, the veteran who served without seeking recognition, and the contrast with Emily's public mockery made the narrative irresistible to people hungry for justice and vindication. I didn't want any of it. I'm not on social media, never have been, and I refused to create accounts just to read what strangers thought of the worst night of my life. I declined every interview request, and there were dozens. Local news wanted me on their morning shows. National outlets wanted exclusive sit-downs. Podcasts about military service wanted to feature my story. A literary agent emailed asking if I'd ever considered writing a memoir. I ignored them all and tried to return to my quiet civilian life, to my job, flying medical transports, to my routine of work and gym, and the occasional dinner with the few friends who knew me before I became an internet sensation. But the attention was suffocating. Reporters camped outside my apartment building, waiting to catch me coming or going, shouting questions about Emily, about the wedding, about whether I'd spoken to my family since. My building manager called to complain about the disruption. Former soldiers I'd served with, people I hadn't heard from in years, reached out publicly on their own social media platforms, posting their own tributes and thank yous, tagging me even though I had no accounts to tag. My work email, which was supposed to be for coordinating medical flights, flooded with messages from strangers thanking me for my service, sharing their own military stories, asking for advice, offering support I hadn't requested. The attention felt like the opposite of the invisibility I'd lived with my whole life, but it wasn't better. It was just a different kind of suffocating. I hadn't asked for this. I'd just wanted to attend my sister's wedding, sit quietly in the back, and leave without causing trouble. That's all I'd ever wanted from my family, just to exist without being either celebrated or condemned, just to be seen as I was. Instead, I'd become a symbol, a character in a story millions of people were telling each other about respect and heroism and family dysfunction, and none of them knew me at all. 3 days after the wedding, when I'd finally managed to stop checking my phone every 5 minutes, when the reporter stationed outside my building had given up and left, when I thought maybe the storm was beginning to pass. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was another stranger with an opinion about my life. But something made me open it. The message read, "We need to talk, not about the wedding, about Afghanistan, about what you did 8 years ago. You probably don't remember, but I do. Meet me." It was signed simply, Ethan. My heart began to race, that old combat instinct kicking in when something doesn't add up, when the situation is more complex than it appears. Afghanistan. 8 years ago, I'd flown dozens of missions during my deployments, pulled countless soldiers out of bad situations, saved lives I never learned the names attached to. That was the nature of combat rescue. You were a voice on the radio, a bird in the sky, coordinates and timing and adrenaline. You didn't usually know who you saved or what happened to them after you dropped them at the field hospital. How could Ethan possibly be connected to my past? What did he know that I didn't? And why now, after everything that had just happened, did he need to tell me? I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the delete button. Part of me wanted to erase it, block the number, pretend I'd never seen it. I could disappear, change my number, maybe even move to a different city where no one knew about the viral video or my call sign or any of it. But another part of me, the part that had always flown toward danger instead of away from it, needed to know. He said there was something I needed to know about the past I'd tried to forget. I responded to Ethan's text with a single word, where. He suggested a cafe 40 miles outside the city, a place neither of us would be recognized far enough from the media circus that had consumed the last 3 days. I drove there the next morning, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my mind cycling through possibilities. What could he possibly need to tell me about Afghanistan that was so urgent, so private, that it couldn't wait or be discussed over the phone? The knot in my stomach tightened with every mile. The cafe was exactly what I'd hoped for. Small, quiet, tucked into a strip mall between a laundromat and a hardware store. Only 3 other customers occupied the scattered tables when I arrived. Ethan was already there, sitting in the back corner with his back to the wall the way people with combat experience always sit. He wore jeans and a plain gray shirt, civilian clothes, that made him look younger and more vulnerable than he had in his dress whites. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept since the wedding. I slid into the seat across from him, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "I'm sorry about what happened at the reception. I didn't plan that. I didn't mean to hijack Emily's wedding or put you in the spotlight." His voice was rough, sincere. "But when you said what you did, when you said your call sign, something inside me just snapped. I couldn't let her mock you like that. Not you." I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup the waitress had placed in front of me, needing something to hold. "You said this was about Afghanistan, about 8 years ago." He nodded slowly, his eyes searching my face as if trying to find the right words. Then he asked, his voice careful and deliberate, "Do you remember a mission in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, August 2017? A SEAL team ambushed extraction under heavy fire." The coffee cup trembled in my hands. Everything inside me went still and cold the way it always did when someone mentioned that mission. I remembered. God, I remembered. You don't forget missions like that, the ones where you know you're probably going to die, but you go anyway because 6 men are counting on you to be insane enough to try. The Taliban had the high ground firing from 3 positions, and the SEAL team was pinned in a dried riverbed with nowhere to go. Every other helicopter in the area had been grounded due to the intensity of the fire. Command was calling it a loss, preparing to send in ground reinforcement that would take hours to arrive. Hours those men didn't have. I'd been the ranking pilot on duty. I'd made the call. We were going in. My co-pilot had looked at me like I was crazy, but he'd strapped in anyway because that's what you do. We flew low and fast terrain masking to avoid the worst of it, but once we reached the extraction point, we were exposed. I could hear the rounds hitting the hull, that distinctive metallic ping that meant your aircraft was taking damage, and all you could do was pray. Nothing critical got hit. My co-pilot was screaming coordinates and warnings. The crew chief was returning fire, and I kept my voice level on the radio, telling those 6 men below that we were coming, that I had them, that they needed to be ready to move the second we touched down. "I pulled out 6 men," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the cafe's background music. "Barely made it out alive. My helicopter took 17 bullets. One of them passed 6 inches from my head." Ethan's eyes were wet. He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "My younger brother David was one of those 6 men." His voice cracked on his brother's name. "He survived that day because of you. Because you flew in when no one else would. He made it home, got to see our parents again, got to have 3 more months of life." He paused, swallowing hard. "He was killed 3 months later in another operation, an IED. He died instantly." The air left my lungs. One of those 6 men I'd pulled out of hell, one of the voices I'd heard over the radio that day, desperate and scared, but trying to stay professional, had been Ethan's brother. I'd given him 3 more months. 3 months that ended anyway, in another country, in another mission that went wrong. Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook, worn and stained, the pages warped like it had gotten wet and dried out again. David kept a journal. He wrote in it every day. After he died, my parents gave it to me. He opened it carefully like it was sacred and turned to a page marked with a faded ribbon. This is what he wrote about that day. He slid the journal across the table to me. I looked down at the handwriting, neat and precise, and began to read. August 15th, 2017. Thought I was going to die today. We were pinned down, taking fire from everywhere, and I heard over the radio that all air support was grounded. I called Sarah to say goodbye in my head. Then this voice came over the comms. Female, call sign Iron Widow. She said she was coming to get us. Her voice was so calm, like she was ordering coffee instead of flying into a kill zone. She told us to be ready, that she had us, that we were going home. And she did it. She brought us home. If I ever meet her, I need to thank her. She gave me another chance at life. My vision blurred. I hadn't known any of their names, hadn't known what happened to them after I dropped them at the field hospital. They were just 6 soldiers I'd managed to save, 6 lives I'd added to the mental tally I kept of reasons my work mattered. But to this man, to David, I'd been the difference between dying in that riverbed and getting to live 3 more months, getting to see his family again, getting to write in his journal about the pilot who'd refused to leave him behind. For 8 years I've been trying to find Iron Widow, Ethan said. I wanted to fulfill David's wish to thank you the way he never got to. But that call sign was buried in classified reports. I hit dead ends everywhere I looked. I knew you were Army Aviation, knew the general time frame, but I couldn't get a name. And then 3 nights ago at my wedding, you said it. You said Iron Widow. And I finally understood. The woman who saved my brother, the person I've been searching for, was sitting in the back of the room. My wife's sister. I looked up at him, trying to process the weight of this impossible connection. Why did you marry Emily if you knew about her sister? His face darkened, pain and regret crossing his features. I didn't know. I met Emily 2 years ago. She never talked about you. The only time your name came up, she complained that her sister was cold, that she never came home for holidays, that she'd chosen the military over family. She made you sound distant and uncaring. I had no idea who you really were or what you'd done. I had no idea until that night, until you said those 2 words, that my wife's forgotten sister was the woman I'd been searching for. The weight of fate settled between us like a physical presence. I'd saved his brother 8 years ago, never knowing the ripple effect of that one decision to fly into hell. And now Ethan was bound to my family through marriage, to the woman who'd spent our entire lives hating me, diminishing me, erasing me from family stories. The universe had a cruel sense of irony. We sat in silence for a long moment, both of us trying to absorb the impossible tangle we'd found ourselves in. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his expression shifted to something like dread. It's Emily. She's been calling all morning. He hesitated, then showed me the screen. 12 missed calls. 20 text messages, each one more frantic than the last. What he didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until later, was that Emily had driven to this cafe after tracking his location through his phone. She'd been sitting in her car in the parking lot for the last 20 minutes, watching through the window, as her husband showed me her brother's journal as he told me the story that connected us. She'd seen his tears. She'd seen the way he looked at me with gratitude and respect she'd never earned from him. Emily overheard everything and swore she'd destroy the sister who'd stolen her spotlight forever. I should have known Emily wouldn't let it go. I should have recognized that the sister who'd spent our entire childhood competing for attention wouldn't simply accept being overshadowed at her own wedding. But I'd underestimated her capacity for cruelty, her willingness to burn everything down rather than share even a sliver of the spotlight. 2 weeks after our meeting at the cafe, 2 weeks of relative quiet where I'd almost convinced myself the storm was over, Emily made her move. The tabloid article appeared on a Tuesday morning. Someone forwarded it to me before I'd even gotten out of bed, a former Army colleague, with a message that just said, "WTF is this?" The headline made my blood run cold. Iron Widow's dark secret military pilot involved in fatal training accident. I clicked the link with shaking hands and felt my world tilt sideways as I read. The article claimed I'd been responsible for a helicopter crash during a training exercise 7 years ago, an incident that killed a crew member. It painted me as reckless, glory-seeking someone who'd cut corners and endangered lives in pursuit of my own reputation. The story included what appeared to be excerpts from my service records carefully edited to remove all context, making my decisions look negligent rather than necessary. The truth was so much more complicated than the article suggested. There had been a training accident. A crew member, A young specialist named Torres, who'd been with us less than 6 months, had died when our helicopter experienced catastrophic mechanical failure during a routine exercise. The investigation had lasted 4 months, the most agonizing period of my military career, where every decision I'd made was scrutinized by people who hadn't been in that cockpit. In the end, I'd been fully exonerated. The failure was traced to a maintenance error, a critical component that hadn't been properly inspected before flight. I'd actually managed to prevent additional casualties by bringing the damaged aircraft down in a controlled crash, rather than letting it spin out completely. But none of that nuance appeared in the tabloid article. Just the inflammatory headline and the selectively edited records that made me look like I'd killed someone through my own incompetence. The article spread faster than the original wedding video. Within hours, it was everywhere, shared with the same enthusiasm people had shown when celebrating my heroism. Except now the narrative had flipped. I watched in numb horror as social media turned on me with vicious speed. She's a fraud. People died because of her. The hero worship was always fake. I knew something was off about her. The comments felt like physical blows, each one landing harder than the last. Anonymous strangers who'd praised me days ago now competed to condemn me most eloquently, to prove they'd never been fooled by my supposed heroism. The source of the leak was listed as an anonymous family member close to the situation, but I knew exactly who it was. Those service records weren't public. They were stored in boxes in my parents' attic documents I'd left behind when I moved out years ago because I'd never imagined I'd need to protect them from my own family. Only Emily would have had both access to those records and motivation to weaponize them. Only Emily would know exactly which incident to distort which moment from my past could be twisted into something damaging enough to destroy the reputation she resented so deeply. My employer called me that afternoon. The director of operations, a retired Air Force colonel I'd always respected, sounded pained but firm. "Vanessa, we're placing you on administrative leave pending our own review of the situation. I know you were cleared by the Army, but with the current media attention and the public nature of these allegations, we need to do our due diligence. I'm sure you understand." I did understand. I understood that my nearly 2 decades of spotless service, my hundreds of successful missions, my dedication to safety and excellence meant nothing compared to one sensationalized headline. I was grounded effective immediately. The professional fallout was swift and devastating. Former colleagues who'd reached out after the wedding video to congratulate me and share their own stories now avoided my calls. My inbox, which had been flooded with messages of support, went suddenly quiet. A training seminar I was scheduled to speak at next month sent a terse email uninviting me, citing unforeseen scheduling conflicts. The aviation community is small and tight-knit, and reputation is everything. Once that's compromised, even temporarily, even falsely, the damage spreads like rot through wood. I drove to my parents' house that evening, rage and desperation warring inside me. I needed them to admit what Emily had done to stand up for me the way they'd never managed to do before. My mother answered the door looking tired and defensive before I'd even said a word. I asked her directly if Emily had taken those records, if she'd leaked them to the press. My mother's face tightened. "I don't know what Emily did or didn't do, Vanessa. She's been very upset since the wedding. The whole internet has been calling her terrible names. This wedding attention hurt her deeply. Can't you just let it go?" The words hit me like a slap. My career was being destroyed. My reputation shredded, my ability to do the work I loved, stripped away, and my mother was asking me to let it go because Emily's feelings were hurt. My father stood behind her, silent and useless as always, offering nothing. I realized in that moment that I would never get what I needed from them. They would always choose Emily's comfort over my justice. They would always ask me to be the bigger person to sacrifice, to absorb the damage so Emily didn't have to face consequences. Ethan tried to help. He posted the full investigation report on his social media, explaining in detail that I'd been completely exonerated, that the accident had been mechanical failure beyond my control. He wrote passionately about my service record, about the lives I'd saved, about the integrity I'd always shown. For a brief moment, I thought maybe his voice would cut through the noise that people would listen to someone they respected. But Emily was working on him too, and she knew exactly which buttons to push. She called me crying one night, her voice breaking, as she told Ethan that I was trying to ruin their marriage, that I cared more about clearing my name than about their relationship. She accused me of manipulating him, of using his guilt about his brother to turn him against her. "She's doing this on purpose," I heard her sob in the background when Ethan called to explain why he had to take down his posts. "She's always been jealous of me. Now she wants to destroy my marriage too." Ethan was torn between the truth he knew and the wife crying in his arms. His SEAL team buddies weighed in too, warning him in terms I later learned about. "Don't get involved in family drama. It'll destroy you. Let them work it out themselves." When Ethan called to apologize, to explain that he couldn't keep defending me publicly without destroying his marriage, I told him what I should have said from the beginning. Stop defending me. I appreciate what you tried to do, but this isn't your fight. I'm used to fighting alone." It was true. I'd been fighting alone my entire life, standing up for myself while my family stood together against me. This was no different. Just another battle where I had no backup, no support, no one in my corner. When they took my wings, I learned how to fight on the ground. With no job, no reputation, and no family willing to stand beside me, I had nowhere left to go but back to the place where it all started. The childhood home sat on a quiet street in the suburbs, a modest 2-story house with faded blue siding and a front porch that sagged slightly on one side. My father had bought it 30 years ago when he and my mother were newlyweds, full of optimism about the life they'd build together. He'd died in this house 5 years ago, a heart attack in his sleep that took him before anyone could say goodbye. My mother still lived here alone, too stubborn or too attached to memories to downsize into something more manageable for a woman her age. Emily hadn't visited in over a year, too consumed with wedding planning and her new marriage to make the 2-hour drive to see the woman who'd raised her. I pulled into the driveway on a gray afternoon in early October, the trees already shedding their leaves, and felt the weight of every memory this place held. I'd called ahead to tell my mother I was coming to stay for a while, that I needed some time away from the city. She'd sounded confused on the phone, asking twice who was calling before finally recognizing my voice. Her confusion had worsened over the past year, small moments of forgetfulness blooming into longer stretches where she seemed untethered from the present. Walking through the front door felt like stepping into a time capsule. Nothing had changed. The same worn couch sat in the living room. The same family photos lined the hallway. The same smell of old coffee and lavender air freshener hung in the air. I carried my suitcase upstairs to my old bedroom, which my mother had left exactly as I'd kept it in high school. And then I wandered through the house like a ghost, revisiting the scenes of its former life. In the kitchen, I stood at the counter where I'd made Emily breakfast every morning before school, packing her lunch, while she complained about having to wake up early. In the living room, I remembered positioning myself between Emily and our parents during their worst fights, absorbing their anger so it wouldn't reach her. In the attic, accessed by a pull-down ladder in the hallway, I'd hidden, when the weight of being the family's invisible foundation became too much to bear, sitting among boxes and old furniture where no one thought to look for me. Every corner of this house whispered of sacrifices no one had acknowledged, of the girl who'd held everything together while being told she wasn't doing enough. Being back here didn't bring comfort. It brought clarity about why I'd left and why I'd never truly been welcomed when I returned. My mother's condition became apparent within the first day. She'd forget she'd asked me a question and ask it again 5 minutes later. She'd start cooking dinner and then wander away, leaving pots on the stove. But what disturbed me most were the strange phrases she kept repeating, fragments of sentences that seemed to emerge from some deeper place than her normal confusion. "Your father's secret," she'd murmur while we sat at the kitchen table. "He tried to fix it. The box. Don't let her take it." At first, I dismissed it as dementia, the mind's way of creating connections that didn't exist, pulling together random memories into nonsensical warnings. But the phrases persisted, and they always came with an urgency that felt different from her other confusions. One evening, I mentioned that Emily had called to check on her, and my mother's entire demeanor changed. She grabbed my wrist with surprising strength for someone so frail, her fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave marks. Her eyes, usually cloudy and distant, focused with sudden intensity. "She doesn't know what she did," my mother said, her voice low and fierce. "She doesn't remember." But he knew. He always knew. I tried to ask what she meant, what Emily had done, but my mother released my wrist and retreated back into confusion, asking me if I'd seen her reading glasses when they were sitting right in front of her. The conversation left me unsettled. What secret had my father kept? What had Emily done that she didn't remember but he'd known about? I began to wonder if my mother's dementia was revealing truths she'd kept hidden for years, if the breakdown of her mental filters was allowing buried knowledge to surface in these cryptic warnings. I started paying closer attention to what she said, writing down the fragments in a notebook, looking for patterns. A week into my stay, I decided to clean out my father's old study, a small room off the main hallway that my mother had left untouched since his death. She couldn't bear to sort through his things, she'd said, so everything remained exactly as he'd left it. His desk still covered with papers, his bookshelf still lined with technical manuals from his work as an engineer, his reading chair still positioned by the window. I started with the desk, sorting papers into piles, finding nothing but old bills and work documents. Then I moved to the bookshelf, pulling out volumes to dust behind them. That's when I noticed it. One section of the shelf sat slightly forward from the wall, creating a gap that shouldn't exist. I pulled the books off that shelf completely and examined the back panel. It was loose. I pried it away and found a space behind it, a hollow carved into the wall itself. Hidden in that space was a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, made of dark wood that had been carefully sanded and finished. On the lid, carved in precise letters, were my father's initials, R.M., and below them, carved with the same care, Vanessa. Not Emily, not my daughters, just my name. My hands shook as I pulled the box out. It was locked, but the key was taped to the bottom, as if my father had known that if I found it, I was meant to open it. Inside, I discovered a collection of items that made no immediate sense: legal documents with official seals, a USB drive labeled only with a date from 5 years ago, several letters in my father's distinctive handwriting, and a faded photograph of him standing next to a man I didn't recognize. Both of them in what looked like a lawyer's office. I picked up the letters, noticing they were all addressed to me, but had never been sent. Never even stamped. The first one, dated 3 weeks before my father died, began with words that made my heart stop. "I couldn't protect you from your mother's fear or your sister's envy. I tried to make it right before I died. If you're reading this, I failed. Forgive me." I sat on the floor of that study, the box open in front of me, surrounded by the evidence of secrets my father had kept, and I understood that everything I thought I knew about my family was about to change. Inside that box lay the truth no one dared to face. I spent the rest of that evening sitting on the floor of my father's study, methodically going through everything in the box, trying to understand what he'd been trying to tell me. The first document I examined carefully was a life insurance policy. The paper, yellowed with age, dated exactly 10 years ago. The policy was in my father's name, issued by a major insurance company with a death benefit of $2 million. I scanned down to the beneficiary section, expecting to see my mother's name, but instead found my own. Vanessa Mitchell, listed as the primary beneficiary. The policy had been active for a decade, premiums paid faithfully every month. My father had designated me as the person who would receive this money if anything happened to him, and he'd done it 10 years ago, long before the wedding, long before any of the recent chaos. But clipped to the policy with a rusted paperclip was another document that made my heart race. It was a formal change of beneficiary form, the kind insurance companies require when policyholders want to alter who receives their death benefit. This form was filled out completely, every line of information provided in my father's careful handwriting. The new beneficiary section listed me again, Vanessa Mitchell, as the sole recipient. But this wasn't redundant. I looked closer and realized this was updating a different older policy, one where my mother had originally been the beneficiary. My father had been changing everything over to me. The form was signed at the bottom, his signature shaky but legible, dated just weeks before his death. But there was no insurance company stamp, no filing date, no evidence that this form had ever been submitted. If it had been filed, I would have received $2 million after my father died. Instead, I'd received nothing. My mother had collected the insurance money, and according to what Emily had mentioned casually at a family dinner years ago, she'd given most of it to Emily for her wedding and down payment on a house. My hands trembled as I examined a small note attached to the form with a piece of tape that had turned brown with age. The handwriting was my father's, but shakier than usual, as if he'd written it while exhausted or ill. Vanessa deserves this. She gave up everything for this family. Emily will be fine. She has always been taken care of. If you're reading this, someone stopped me from filing this. Look at the dates. Trust no one. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. My father had tried to make things right. He'd recognized finally that I'd been the one making sacrifices while Emily reaped the benefits. He'd wanted to ensure I received something, some acknowledgement of what I'd given. But someone had stopped him. I looked at the dates with obsessive focus, pulling out my phone to check the calendar from 5 years ago. My father had signed the beneficiary change form on a Tuesday. According to the death certificate I'd seen during the funeral arrangements, he'd died that Friday morning. 3 days. In those 3 days, someone had prevented this form from reaching the insurance company. Who had been with him during that time? I grabbed the small desk calendar my mother had left in the study, the one my father used to track appointments. Tuesday showed no entries. Wednesday had one notation, Dr. Chen, 2 p.m. Dr. Marcus Chen, our family physician, a man who'd been friends with my parents for decades and particularly close to my mother. Thursday's entry simply said, Emily dinner. My sister had visited that night, something I vaguely remembered hearing about after the fact since I'd been deployed at the time. Friday was blank, the day he died. My mother had been with him throughout. Emily had visited the night before his death, and Dr. Chen had seen him the day after he signed the form. One of them, or all of them together, had to know what happened to this document. One of them had prevented my father's final wish from being carried out. I picked up the USB drive with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The small device felt impossibly heavy, loaded with information I both desperately needed and deeply feared. I opened my laptop, plugged in the drive, and waited as the files loaded. There were 7 audio files, each labeled only with a date. The earliest was from 6 weeks before my father's death. The most recent was dated the day he signed the beneficiary form. I clicked on that one first, needing to understand what had happened on that specific day. The recording began with ambient noise, the sound of papers shuffling, a chair creaking. Then my father's voice, weaker than I remembered it, but still unmistakably him. I'm doing this for Vanessa. She deserves to know she mattered. His words were slightly slurred, as if he were tired or medicated. I heard him moving around the scratch of a pen on paper. He was narrating his own actions, I realized, creating a record of what he was doing. I filled out the beneficiary change form. I'm signing it now. Tomorrow I'll take it to the insurance office myself. No one can stop this. Vanessa gave up her youth for this family. Emily will be fine. She's always been fine. Then I heard a door open. Footsteps. My father's voice, surprised. I thought you were at the store. And then another voice, sharp and accusatory, cutting through the recording with words that made my stomach drop. You're giving everything to her after everything Emily has been through. It was my mother's voice, filled with an anger I recognized from childhood, from all those times when I'd done something that somehow made Emily's life harder by comparison. More shuffling sounds, as if my father was trying to hide the papers. This isn't everything, he said, his voice defensive. This is just the insurance. The house is still yours. The savings account is still yours. But Vanessa deserves something. She's never asked for anything. My mother's voice rose, losing the tight control she usually maintained. Emily has been through so much. Her anxiety, her struggles with self-esteem, all because she grew up in Vanessa's shadow. You're going to reward Vanessa for making her sister feel inadequate. The logic was so twisted, so perfectly representative of how my mother had always seen our relationship that I felt physically sick. I'd been punished my entire life for being competent, for not needing as much attention, for making Emily feel bad simply by existing and succeeding. Emily has been coddled her entire life. My father said, his voice gaining strength, gaining certainty. Vanessa has been forgotten. This is the least I can do. There was a pause, heavy with tension. Then my mother's voice, colder now, controlled again. If you do this, you'll regret it. Emily is your daughter too. Think about what this will do to her. The recording ended abruptly, cut off mid-conversation, as if my father had reached over and stopped it. I sat frozen, staring at the laptop screen. My mother had known. She'd been there when my father signed the form. She'd argued against it, threatened him, tried to make him feel guilty for finally acknowledging my sacrifices. And then in the next 3 days before he died, that form had never made it to the insurance company. I clicked on the next file, dated the following day, the day Dr. Chen had visited. And that voice in the background, I knew it too well. The second audio file was dated 2 days after the first, which meant it was recorded the day before my father died. I clicked play with a sense of dread settling into my bones, knowing that whatever I was about to hear would change everything. The recording began with the sound of a door opening, footsteps on hardwood. Then my mother's voice, higher pitched than usual, shaking with something between fear and anger. Emily, what are you doing in your father's study? Did you take the insurance form? There was a pause, the guilty silence of someone caught doing something they shouldn't. Then Emily's voice, and it was younger than I was used to hearing it, less polished. She'd been 31 when our father died, still living at home between jobs, still dependent on our parents for financial support. He's being ridiculous, Mom. He wants to give everything to Vanessa just because she joined the military. That's not fair. Her voice carried that same petulant tone I remembered from childhood, the sound of someone who'd never been denied anything and couldn't comprehend why she should start now. My mother's response was quieter, conflicted. Emily, you can't just destroy legal documents. That's a crime. Put it back. I could hear the weakness in her words, even through the recording, the way she was trying to assert authority while already preparing to back down. This was the mother I knew, the one who set boundaries for Emily, but never enforced them, who threatened consequences, but never followed through. I can't keep living in her shadow. Emily's voice broke into sobs, and I could picture her perfectly, tears streaming down her face, using emotion as a weapon the way she always had. Everything is always about perfect Vanessa. She's so brave, she's so strong, she saves lives. What about me? What about what I need? I'm tired of being the disappointment just because I'm not a war hero. The recording captured the sound of my mother comforting Emily, murmuring reassurances I couldn't quite make out. Then footsteps leaving the room, a door closing, and silence. My father's recording device had captured the confrontation, but he hadn't been present for it. He'd hidden the recorder in his study, I realized, suspecting that someone might try to interfere with his plans. He'd been right. I clicked on the third file, my hands shaking so badly I almost couldn't control the mouse. This recording was time-stamped later that same night, nearly 11 o'clock. It began with my father's voice, and the devastation in it was like a physical blow. You burned it. You burned the form. There was disbelief and heartbreak in those words, the sound of a man realizing his own daughter had betrayed him in the most fundamental way. Emily's response was immediate, desperate sobbing that made her words almost unintelligible. I'm sorry, Daddy, I just want you to love me as much as you love her. She was wailing now, the way she'd wailed as a child when she didn't get her way, except this wasn't about a toy or permission to go to a party. This was about $2 million and a lifetime of resentment finally erupting into action. My father's voice, when it came again, was breaking apart. "I've always loved you, Emily. But this isn't about love, this is about fairness. Vanessa sacrificed her youth for this family. She deserves—" And then the terrible sound. A gasp, sharp and pained. A crash, as if something heavy had fallen. The distinctive thud of a body hitting the floor. My mother's scream cut through everything else. "Call 911, he's having a heart attack." Emily's wailing intensified incoherent words of panic and regret. I could hear my mother on the phone with emergency services, her voice shaking as she gave the address as she described my father's symptoms as she begged them to hurry. The recording continued, and I forced myself to listen to all of it. The sound of my mother trying to perform CPR, counting compressions out loud while Emily sobbed in the background. The sirens growing louder as the ambulance approached. The paramedics rushing in their professional voices, cutting through the chaos as they took over as they worked on my father with urgent efficiency. Someone must have touched the recording device because there was a scraping sound and then muffled audio, as if it had been moved or covered. But it kept recording through everything. 14 minutes of desperate attempts to save him. 14 minutes that ended with a paramedic's quiet voice saying, "I'm calling it. Time of death, 11:43 p.m. Then nothing. The file ended. I sat in the darkness of my father's study, the laptop screen the only source of light, and let the truth wash over me in waves of grief and rage and terrible understanding. My father hadn't been murdered. No one had poisoned him or deliberately hurt him. But Emily's actions had killed him as surely as if she'd put a weapon in his hands. He'd had a heart condition, something I vaguely remembered hearing about years ago, controlled with medication and careful management of stress. The shock of discovering that Emily had destroyed the insurance form, that his own daughter had burned the document that represented his attempt to finally acknowledge my sacrifices, had triggered a massive cardiac event his weakened heart couldn't survive. Emily hadn't meant to kill him. She just wanted to keep the money to ensure that her position as the favored child remained unchallenged, even in death. She'd acted out of jealousy and entitlement and that toxic combination of insecurity and narcissism that had defined her entire life. But the result was the same. Our father died on the floor of his study, surrounded by the wreckage of Emily's selfishness, knowing in his final moments that his attempt to make things right had failed. And my mother, instead of telling the truth, had covered it up. She'd never mentioned the insurance form to me. She'd never explained that my father had tried to leave me something that he'd finally recognized the imbalance in how they'd treated us. She'd collected the insurance money from the original policy, the one that listed her as beneficiary, and she'd given most of it to Emily. For the wedding, for the down payment on a house, for all the things Emily wanted and felt entitled to have. My mother had watched me struggle financially, had known I was sending money home to help with bills, even though I could barely afford it, and she'd said nothing. She'd let Emily benefit from the very betrayal that had killed our father. I thought about the wedding, about Emily's cruelty in mocking me publicly, and I understood it differently now. She'd been living with this guilt for 5 years, this knowledge that she'd destroyed something precious, and it had cost our father his life. Every time she looked at me, she saw the person she'd stolen from. Every time someone praised my service or my sacrifices, it reminded her of what she'd done. Her cruelty wasn't just about jealousy anymore. It was about self-preservation, about destroying my credibility, so she could feel less guilty about destroying my inheritance. I closed the laptop and sat in complete darkness, tears streaming silently down my face. I thought about all the times I'd protected Emily, all the times I'd absorbed pain so she wouldn't have to feel it, all the years I'd spent being invisible so she could shine. And this was what it had earned me: a father who'd tried too late to make things right. A sister who'd rather see him dead than see me acknowledged. A mother who'd chosen protecting Emily over honoring my father's final wishes. Guilt, I realized, can be heavier than blood. I spent the rest of that night going through every document in the box, methodically cataloging what my father had left behind. The guilt of what had happened to him sat heavy in my chest, But beneath it grew something colder and more focused, the need to understand the full scope of what had been taken from me. Near the bottom of the box, beneath the USB drive and the insurance documents, I found another set of papers that made my breath catch. It was a will, handwritten on legal paper, my father's distinctive engineering-precise handwriting filling the pages. The document was dated the same day he'd signed the insurance beneficiary change form, which meant he'd spent that entire day trying to set things right before it was too late. I read through it carefully, my hands steady despite the rage building inside me. The will left the family home to me, along with all of his military memorabilia from his own service in the Navy, his personal savings account, and his collection of first-edition books he'd spent decades accumulating. To my mother, he left the remainder of their joint accounts and his pension benefits. To Emily, he left his car and a small monetary gift of $10,000, along with a note that said she'd already received more than her share of support during his lifetime. The will was properly formatted, signed by my father, and notarized by 2 witnesses whose signatures and dates were clearly visible at the bottom. This was a legal document created with intention and care, but I'd never seen it before. After my father died, I'd been deployed in Germany, unable to get emergency leave in time for the funeral. By the time I made it home 3 weeks later, the estate had already been processed. My mother had told me there wasn't much that my father's medical bills had eaten through most of their savings, that the house would go to her and eventually to Emily since I was never around anyway. I'd accepted it because I was grieving and exhausted, and I'd never expected anything from my family. I hadn't known there was something to expect. I pulled out my phone and searched for the probate records public documents available through the county clerk's office. It took me 20 minutes to navigate the website and find my father's case. There, scanned and uploaded, was the will that had been filed with the court. I downloaded it and compared it to the handwritten version in my hands. The filed will was typed, formatted professionally, and it left everything to my beloved wife and younger daughter, Emily. The reasoning given was that Vanessa has chosen a life independent of this family and has expressed no interest in maintaining our family home or legacy. I stared at both documents side by side on my laptop screen and the handwritten pages in my lap. The content was completely different, but both bore my father's signature at the bottom. I looked closer at the filed will's signature, zooming in on the digital scan. Something was wrong. The signature looked like my father's at first glance, but the more I studied it, the more I noticed the subtle differences. The pressure was too even, the curves too perfect. My father's natural signature had a slight tremor, a consequence of early-stage arthritis in his hands. This signature was smooth traced, as if someone had copied his signature from another document and reproduced it carefully. Someone had created a fake will after he died, and no one had questioned it because I wasn't there to contest it. I'd been deployed overseas during the funeral, absent during the estate settlement, and by the time I returned, everything had been decided without me. The next morning, I called Mr. Harrison, the attorney who'd handled my father's estate. I remembered him vaguely from my childhood, an elderly man who'd done legal work for my parents for decades. He was semi-retired now, his secretary informed me, but she could schedule an appointment for later that week. I told her it was urgent, that it concerned my father's estate and possible fraud. She put me through immediately. When I arrived at his office 3 days later, Mr. Harrison looked older than I remembered, his hair completely white. Now his movements slow and careful. I laid out the evidence on his desk without preamble. The handwritten will, the typed will from probate, the insurance documents, copies of the audio recordings. I watched his face drain of color as he examined everything, his hands trembling slightly as he turned pages. "I don't understand," he said finally, his voice thin. "Emily brought me that typed will the day after your father died. She was devastated, crying so hard she could barely speak. She said your father had dictated it to her in his final days because he was too weak to write, that he'd been worried about dying without proper arrangements." He looked up at me, and I saw genuine distress in his eyes. "I'd known your family for 30 years. I believed her. I never questioned it because Emily seemed so sincere and you were deployed and your mother confirmed everything Emily said. Did my father contact you before he died? I asked, keeping my voice level. Harrison nodded slowly, reaching for a desk calendar from 5 years ago that he apparently still kept. Your father called me 2 days before he died, he said quietly, running his finger down the entries. He said he was making important changes to his estate and would bring documents to my office that Friday. He sounded determined, clear-headed. I told him I'd block out time for him that afternoon. He looked at me with something like shame. He never made it. When I heard he'd died that Thursday night, I assumed the changes he'd mentioned never happened. I'm so sorry, Vanessa. If you have the original handwritten will, if you have proof of what he actually wanted, this changes everything. I left Harrison's office with a signed affidavit stating everything he'd just told me, his confession that he'd been deceived, his acknowledgement that the will he'd filed was likely fraudulent. I had what I needed to blow my family apart, to expose Emily's crime and my mother's complicity in covering it up. But unlike Emily, who'd acted impulsively out of jealousy and destroyed evidence in a moment of panic, I wasn't going to rush into anything. I'd spent my entire military career planning complex operations, calculating risks, anticipating opposition. I would approach this the same way. Over the next week, I made copies of everything. Digital scans stored in encrypted cloud accounts. Physical copies placed in 3 separate safe deposit boxes at different banks. I gave one complete set to a friend from my Army days, with instructions to release them if anything happened to me. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being thorough. Then I scheduled consultations with 3 different attorneys who specialized in estate fraud and probate litigation. The third attorney, a sharp woman in her 50s named Patricia Chen, laid out the reality with brutal honesty. You have an excellent case, she said, reviewing my evidence with the focused attention of someone who recognized its value. The handwritten will, the notarization, the audio recordings proving Emily destroyed the insurance form, the attorney's confession that he was deceived. Any court would rule in your favor. She paused, looking at me directly. But you need to understand what this will cost. It will destroy your family publicly. The recordings will become court exhibits available to the media. Your mother's complicity in covering up Emily's actions will be exposed. Emily will likely face criminal charges for fraud and destruction of legal documents. This won't be a quiet settlement. This will be a spectacle. I sat with that knowledge for days, turning it over in my mind, examining it from every angle. I didn't want revenge, or at least I didn't think I did. What I wanted was acknowledgement. I wanted someone in my family to finally admit that I'd mattered, that I'd sacrificed, that I deserved more than erasure. But maybe Patricia was right when she'd suggested during our consultation that sometimes the only way to get acknowledgement from people who've spent your whole life denying you is to force it through legal action. Maybe in my family, justice and revenge were the same thing, because nothing less than total exposure would make them see what they'd done. Justice, I realized, wasn't about rage, it was about timing. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my childhood home, surrounded by copies of documents and legal notes, trying to map out the exact sequence of events that had led to my father's death when someone knocked on the front door. My mother was upstairs napping, her afternoon routine that had become more frequent as her confusion worsened. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered not answering, too exhausted and emotionally raw to deal with whatever neighbor or distant relative might be checking in. But the knock came again, more insistent, and I pushed back from the table and went to see who it was. Ethan stood on the porch, still in his work clothes, looking like he'd driven straight here without thinking about it. His face was drawn tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. When our eyes met, something passed between us, the recognition of 2 people who'd both been caught in the wreckage of Emily's selfishness. I know something happened to your father, he said without preamble. And I know Emily is involved. I should have asked how he knew, should have been more careful about who I trusted, but I was so tired of carrying this alone that I just stepped aside and let him in. We sat at the kitchen table and he told me what had been happening in his marriage since the wedding. He and Emily were barely speaking, sleeping in separate rooms, moving through their house like hostile strangers. Emily had become increasingly paranoid, making frantic phone calls to my mother at all hours, conversations that ended abruptly whenever Ethan walked into the room. He'd overheard fragments. "She can't prove anything. Just stay calm. Keep Vanessa away from family business." His SEAL training had taught him to read people, to recognize when someone was hiding something significant, and Emily was hiding something that terrified her. "I'm not here as her husband," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I'm here as someone who owes you a debt I can never repay. My brother lived because of you. If you're fighting something, I want to help." I showed him everything. The box, the insurance documents, the wills, the audio recordings. I watched his face as he listened to my father's voice, to Emily admitting she'd burned the beneficiary form, to the sounds of my father's heart attack and death. When the recordings ended, Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, processing what he'd heard. Then he said, "We need to get your father's medical records. All of them." I'd thought the recordings were enough, that the evidence I had was complete, but Ethan saw angles I'd missed. We spent the next 2 days navigating the bureaucracy of medical record requests, using my status as next of kin and Ethan's military connections to expedite the process. When the files finally arrived, thick manila envelopes full of forms and reports, we spread them across the dining room table and began reading through every page. The autopsy report was straightforward, exactly what I'd been told 5 years ago: acute myocardial infarction, a massive heart attack caused by complete blockage of his coronary arteries. Cause of death was listed as natural, related to his existing heart condition. I'd read this report once before, shortly after the funeral, and it had seemed definitive. But Ethan read with the careful attention of someone trained to find details others missed. He stopped on page 7 in the toxicology section, his finger tracing a line of text. "Look at this," he said, turning the report toward me. "Diazepam levels. Do you see the numbers?" I looked where he was pointing. The toxicology screen showed elevated levels of diazepam in my father's system at the time of death. The number meant nothing to me, but there was a note from the medical examiner: level consistent with 50 mg dose, triple the standard 5 mg prescription. Not lethal, but unusually high for routine anxiety management. I remembered my father taking anxiety medication, small blue pills he kept in the bathroom cabinet, but he'd always been careful with medication, meticulous about following dosage instructions. Who filled his prescriptions? Ethan asked the critical question I should have thought to ask myself. We went back through the medical records until we found the prescription history. Every refill for the past 3 years had been called in by the same physician, Dr. Marcus Chen. The name made my stomach drop. Dr. Chen, the family friend whose name had appeared in my father's calendar 2 days before his death. The doctor my mother had known for decades, who'd been at family dinners and holiday parties, who'd always had a soft spot for my mother and would do small favors for her without charge. Dr. Chen's practice had closed 2 years ago when he retired, but I found the address online, and we drove there the next morning. The office was now a tax preparation service, the waiting room completely transformed. But the office manager knew of a nurse who'd worked for Dr. Chen and was willing to talk to us. We tracked her down to a small apartment across town where she lived with her daughter's family. Her name was Margaret, and she was in her 70s now, her hands shaking slightly as she invited us in. When we explained why we were there, when I told her about my father's death and the elevated diazepam levels, Margaret's face creased with sadness and something that looked like guilt. Dr. Chen was a good man for most of his career, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. But after his wife died, he got lonely. He started doing favors for old friends, things he shouldn't have done, refilling prescriptions without proper examinations, sometimes prescribing higher doses than necessary if someone asked. She looked at me with sympathy. Your mother was kind to him after his wife passed. She'd invite him to dinner, check in on him. He would have done anything she asked. The implications settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. My mother had asked Dr. Chen for something. Maybe she'd told him my father was stressed, that he wasn't sleeping, that he needed something stronger to calm his anxiety. Maybe she'd convinced herself it was harmless, that she was just helping her husband through a difficult period. Maybe she'd never intended for anything bad to happen. But she'd gotten those pills from Dr. Chen, and they'd been in my father's system at triple the normal dose when his heart gave out. The stress of discovering Emily's betrayal had triggered the heart attack, but the medication had been there too, clouding his judgment, affecting his heart rate, creating conditions where a stressful confrontation could become fatal. Margaret confirmed that Dr. Chen had prescribed diazepam for my father in the weeks before his death at a dosage higher than standard protocol would recommend. She didn't know if my mother had specifically requested the higher dose, but she knew Dr. Chen wouldn't have questioned it if a longtime friend had asked. He'd trusted my mother had wanted to help, had bent the rules because he was lonely, and she made him feel valued. I walked out of that apartment building with Ethan beside me, the afternoon sun too bright, the world too normal for what I'd just learned. My father's death wasn't just about Emily's impulsive destruction of evidence. It was about a cascade of selfish decisions, each person in my family choosing what was easiest or most comfortable rather than what was right. My mother had wanted my father calm and compliant during his stressful period of changing his estate plans. Dr. Chen had wanted to help a friend and feel useful. Emily had wanted to secure her inheritance. And all of it together had created the perfect conditions for tragedy. And the pills that killed him came from the woman he'd loved for 40 years. I waited until the next evening when my mother was having one of her clearer days, when her eyes focused and she recognized me without confusion. I spread everything across the kitchen table, the recordings, the documents, the medical records, the evidence of what had really happened to my father. Ethan offered to stay, but I told him this was something I needed to do alone. Some confrontations require witnesses. This one required only family. My mother looked at the papers spread before her, and I watched recognition dawn, slowly followed by fear. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice already defensive, already preparing to retreat into confusion if necessary. "The truth," I said simply. "About Dad, about the insurance form, about the medication." I slid the medical examiner's report across the table, the toxicology section highlighted. He had triple the normal dose of diazepam in his system when he died. Dr. Chen prescribed it, but Dad never took more than what was prescribed. Someone had to give it to him. My mother's hands started to shake. She tried denial first, shaking her head, insisting she didn't know what I was talking about, that I was confused, that my deployment had affected my memory. Then came anger, her voice rising as she accused me of disrespecting my father's memory, of trying to cause trouble when I should just let the past stay buried. But when I reached for my laptop and opened the audio file, when my father's voice filled the kitchen, talking about trying to make things right for me, her anger crumbled into desperation. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't play that. I can't hear it again." But I played it anyway. I played the recording of Emily burning the insurance form of my father, discovering what she'd done, of his voice breaking as he tried to tell Emily he'd always loved her, but this wasn't about love. And then I played the terrible sounds that followed the gasping and the crash, and my mother's screaming, the chaos of his death filling the kitchen where we'd eaten thousands of meals as a family. When the recording ended, my mother collapsed forward onto the table, her whole body shaking with sobs. Through her crying, the truth came out in fragments. She admitted she'd asked Dr. Chen for something to help my father relax. "He was so agitated about money and the future," she sobbed. "He kept talking about making changes, about fairness, and I knew it would upset Emily. I just wanted peace in the house. I just wanted him calm enough to think clearly." She'd never intended to hurt him. She'd truly believed she was helping, that a little extra medication would take the edge off his stress, would make him more reasonable, more willing to maintain the status quo that kept Emily happy. When he died, when she realized the medication might have contributed, she panicked. Emily was hysterical with guilt. Admitting that the pills might have played a role seemed impossible, seemed like it would destroy Emily completely. So my mother made a choice. She stayed silent. She let Emily burn the evidence of her own guilt. She allowed the false will to be filed. She took the insurance money and gave it to Emily, building her daughter's perfect life on top of her father's death. I was still processing this confession when my phone rang. My mother's phone. The screen showed Emily's name. My mother looked at me with terrified eyes and I nodded. She answered, putting it on speaker. Emily's voice came through frantic. Mom, what's happening? Why did you call me crying? Is it Vanessa? Is she there? My mother couldn't speak, couldn't form words through her sobbing. I took the phone. Emily, you need to come here, now. She arrived 20 minutes later, walking into the kitchen and freezing when she saw the documents spread across the table, saw my mother's tear-stained face, saw me sitting calmly with my laptop open. What is this? She asked, but her voice was small, already knowing, already bracing for impact. The truth, I said, echoing what I'd told my mother. About what you did, about what it cost. I watched Emily's face as I showed her the evidence, as I explained what I'd discovered. At first, she tried to maintain her composure, tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, but when I played the recording of her burning the insurance form when she heard her own voice from 5 years ago saying she couldn't live in my shadow, her face crumbled completely. She admitted everything, the words pouring out like she'd been waiting years to confess. She'd burned the form because she felt invisible, felt unloved, felt that I'd abandoned the family for the military and didn't deserve anything from a father I barely saw. I didn't know it would kill him, she screamed, her voice raw with anguish. I just wanted him to see me, to choose me for once. I just wanted to matter as much as you did. Emily collapsed onto the floor, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, and the words kept coming. Every day since his death, she'd been haunted by guilt. The wedding money, the house, the perfect life she'd built, all of it, was constructed on top of their father's death, and she knew it. She couldn't sleep without medication, couldn't breathe without anxiety clawing at her throat. Every time she looked at me, she saw the person she'd stolen from, saw the sister their father had finally tried to acknowledge, and the guilt was unbearable. That's why she'd become cruel, why she'd mocked me at the wedding, why she'd leaked my service records to destroy my reputation. Because seeing me was seeing her own guilt reflected back, and destroying me was easier than facing what she'd done. I stood in the wreckage of my family, surrounded by people who'd hurt me profoundly, and I realized something that made me feel emptier than angry. None of them were monsters. My mother wasn't evil, just weak and desperate to avoid conflict at any cost. Emily wasn't malicious, just pathologically needy and willing to destroy anything that threatened her position as the favored child. My father had tried to correct a lifetime of favoritism, but he'd waited too long, acted too late, and his attempt at fairness had triggered the cascade of selfishness that killed him. No one had intended murder. They'd just all made choices based on their own fears and needs, and those choices had compounded into tragedy. I looked at Emily sobbing on the kitchen floor at my mother bent over the table with her head in her hands, and I felt not the satisfaction of vindication, but the exhaustion of understanding. We were both victims, Emily and I, of a family that had never learned how to love both daughters equally, that had pitted us against each other from childhood, and then acted surprised when jealousy and resentment festered into something toxic. The difference was that I'd learned to survive without their love. Emily never had. I was about to tell them what I planned to do with all this evidence, about to lay out my terms for how we moved forward, when my phone buzzed with a news alert. Then another, and another. I looked down at the screen and felt my blood turn to ice. The headline read, "Iron Widow Family Scandal, Sister Accused of Destroying Will Father's Death Under Investigation." Someone had leaked the story. Then the news broke and the whole world learned our secrets. I never found out exactly who leaked the story. It could have been a neighbor who'd heard Emily screaming through the windows that night. It could have been someone at the hospital who'd noticed Ethan and me requesting medical records and sensed a story worth selling. It could have been Margaret, the nurse, who'd talked to us about Dr. Chen's inappropriate prescribing, feeling guilty enough to want the truth exposed. Or it could have been someone at Mr. Harrison's law office who'd seen the evidence of the falsified will. Whoever it was, they'd given the media enough details to make the story irresistible, and once it started, there was no stopping it. The first article appeared in a regional tabloid 2 days after my confrontation with Emily and my mother. The headline read, "Wedding Scandal Deepens Bride Accused of Destroying Father's Will." By the next morning, larger outlets had picked it up, each adding their own sensationalized angle. Iron Widow's father died amid family financial betrayal, ran on a major news website. The dark truth behind the viral wedding video appeared on entertainment blogs. The story had everything journalists craved: a decorated war hero, a jealous sister, a dead father, insurance fraud, and the delicious irony that the bride who'd mocked her sister at her own wedding was now exposed as a criminal. It was perfect clickbait, perfect content for the outrage economy that fueled modern media. Within 48 hours, reporters had found the family home. I watched through the curtains as news vans parked along the street, cameras pointed at the house. Journalists standing on the sidewalk doing stand-ups for their segments. They camped outside Emily's house too, I learned from frantic texts she sent, and they'd found my apartment, though I'd already left to stay with a friend. Everywhere our family existed, cameras followed, microphones extended, questions shouted at anyone who walked past. The coverage was relentless, obsessive, picking apart every detail of our family's dysfunction with the gleeful cruelty of strangers who had nothing to lose. The internet, which had celebrated me after the wedding salute, now turned its analytical machinery onto every aspect of our lives. Reddit threads dissected the timeline of my father's death. Twitter arguments raged about whether Emily should face criminal charges. TikTok videos used audio from news reports to create dramatic reenactments. Instagram accounts dedicated to family drama reposted old photos of Emily's perfect wedding, juxtaposing them with headlines about fraud and betrayal. Every detail of our family's private pain became public entertainment, consumed by millions of people who felt entitled to judge us because we'd been foolish enough to become a story. My mother collapsed under the weight of it. 3 days after the story broke, I got a call from a neighbor saying an ambulance had taken her to the hospital. I rushed there to find her in a psychiatric ward, sedated and barely responsive, suffering from what the doctors called an acute nervous breakdown. The scrutiny, the shame, the exposure of her complicity in covering up Emily's crime and her role in my father's death had shattered whatever fragile mental stability she'd been clinging to. She kept repeating the same phrases: "I just wanted peace. I just wanted peace." And the doctor said she'd need long-term care, that the damage to her psyche was severe. Emily's life disintegrated even faster. Her friends abandoned her, not quietly but publicly, posting statements on their social media accounts, distancing themselves from her actions. "I had no idea Emily was capable of this," one former bridesmaid wrote. "I can't support someone who would destroy her own father's will and then mock her hero sister." The comments beneath these posts were vicious, celebrating each friend's betrayal as if it were justice. Emily's employer, a boutique PR firm that depended on reputation and image, called her in for a meeting and let her go. They phrased it as a mutual decision, but everyone knew the truth. Her Instagram account, once carefully curated with photos of her perfect house and perfect marriage, was flooded with hate. "You're disgusting. Thief. Your father is rolling in his grave. How do you sleep at night knowing you killed him?" She tried blocking users, deleting comments, but they came faster than she could remove them. Finally, she deleted everything, every photo, every post, every trace of the life she'd built, and her account went silent. I was horrified. This wasn't what I'd wanted. I'd wanted acknowledgement, wanted my family to finally see what they'd done to me, wanted justice for my father's stolen wishes. But I'd never wanted this public execution, this circus of cruelty, where strangers competed to condemn Emily and my mother most creatively. Through my attorney, Patricia Chen, I released a statement. "This is a private family matter. I ask for privacy as we navigate this difficult time." But the statement was ignored, buried under the avalanche of hot takes and think pieces about family dysfunction, inheritance disputes, and the price of favoritism. The world was celebrating my vindication. Articles praised my integrity, my patience, my refusal to let injustice stand. I received messages of support from thousands of people, strangers who saw me as a symbol of strength and resilience. But sitting alone in my friend's apartment late at night, watching news coverage that dissected my family's worst moments, I felt nothing but emptiness. I'd wanted to be seen to matter, to have my sacrifices acknowledged. Instead, I'd gotten a media circus that turned my family's tragedy into entertainment. My mother was hospitalized. Emily had lost everything. Our family's private dysfunction was now permanently archived on the internet for anyone to find and judge. I thought about my father's recordings, about his voice saying he wanted to make things right, wanted me to know I'd mattered. If he could see what had happened, if he could see how his attempt at fairness had spiraled into this public destruction of everyone he'd loved, he would have been devastated. He'd wanted to correct an imbalance quietly, privately within the family. Instead, his death had become a scandal, his daughter's relationship permanently severed, his wife broken beyond repair. This wasn't justice. This was just a different kind of tragedy. I sat in the darkness, wondering if there was any way forward that didn't end in total destruction, any path that led somewhere other than permanent estrangement and public shame. I'd won, technically. The world knew the truth, but victory felt indistinguishable from loss. That's when Ethan called and asked me to save the woman who'd tried to destroy me. Ethan's voice on the phone was strained, exhausted in a way that went beyond sleepless nights. "My parents just hired an attorney," he said without preamble. "They're filing a civil suit against you. I tried to stop them, but they won't listen. Vanessa, I'm so sorry. This is about to get much worse." He was right. 2 days later, Patricia Chen called to tell me that Ethan's parents, who I'd never even met, had retained one of the most expensive law firms in the state. The civil complaint arrived by courier that afternoon, 43 pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple threat drop: everything or we'll destroy you. They were demanding I relinquish any claim to the insurance money, withdraw any potential criminal complaints against Emily, and sign a statement saying the family dispute had been a misunderstanding born of grief and mental health struggles. Their argument, laid out in carefully crafted legalese, portrayed me as someone using media sympathy to extort a grieving widow who was suffering from severe mental instability brought on by her father's sudden death. They painted Emily as a victim of her own fragile psychology, someone who'd made mistakes while not in her right mind, and who now deserved compassion rather than prosecution. The threat was clear in every paragraph. If I didn't comply, they would drag me through years of litigation. They had unlimited resources and would use them to bury me in motions, depositions, appeals, and procedural warfare. They would ensure the legal fees bankrupted me. They had connections in the aviation industry and would make certain I never worked as a pilot again. The lawsuit wasn't about winning in court. It was about exhaustion, about making the cost of fighting so high that surrender became the only rational choice. Patricia read through the complaint with the grim expression of someone who'd seen this strategy before. "They have unlimited resources," she said finally. "You have a strong case, the evidence is overwhelming, but it could destroy you financially to fight them. We're talking years of litigation, hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and they'll make every step as painful as possible. They're betting you'll give up rather than endure it." I asked her what she recommended, and her answer was brutally honest. "That depends on whether you want justice or whether you want to survive." The worst part was Ethan. He called that evening and asked to meet in person. We sat in the same cafe where he'd first told me about his brother David, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. He couldn't look at me directly, his eyes fixed on his coffee cup as he spoke. "My parents are convinced Emily is suicidal. They say if you press charges, if you take her to court, it will push her over the edge. They're asking me to choose between supporting my wife and betraying my family for—" He paused and I finished the sentence for him. "For a stranger," I said, my voice flat. "That's what they called me, isn't it?" He flinched, but didn't deny it. "I know the truth, Vanessa. I know what Emily did. But they're my parents, and Emily is my wife, and they're telling me that your pursuit of justice might literally kill her." His voice cracked. "I need time to think. I need to figure out what's right here. I stared at the man who'd saluted me at Emily's wedding, who'd helped me investigate my father's death, who'd stood beside me as we uncovered the full scope of my family's betrayal. And I realized he was about to abandon me under the weight of his family's pressure. The man who'd honored me publicly now couldn't even look me in the eye. I felt something cold and familiar settle into my chest, the same feeling I'd carried my whole life. I was alone, and I should never have expected otherwise. "Do what you have to do, Ethan," I said, standing up from the table. "I'm used to being alone." In the week that followed, Ethan stopped answering my calls. My messages went to voicemail. My texts remained unread. I told myself it didn't matter that I'd survived worse betrayals, but it hurt more than I wanted to admit. Then I started seeing the photos. Ethan and Emily at a Sunday church service sitting together in the pew, her head on his shoulder. Ethan and Emily at a charity gala, his arm around her waist, both of them dressed formally and smiling for cameras. The tabloids seized on the images with predictable enthusiasm. Navy SEAL stands by embattled wife. Ethan chooses marriage over sister-in-law drama. Iron widow left alone as family reunites. Social media, which had briefly supported me when the scandal first broke, turned viciously against me once again. Even her biggest supporter left her, someone commented beneath a photo of Ethan and Emily. "She's so bitter she can't let her sister heal," another wrote. "This is why she's alone. She'd rather destroy people than forgive them." The narrative had shifted again. Now I was the vindictive sister, the one who couldn't let go of past grievances, who preferred revenge to reconciliation. Emily, by virtue of having a husband who stood beside her, was being rehabilitated in public opinion as someone who deserved a second chance. I watched this transformation with a detached numbness that came from years of practice. I'd been celebrated, condemned, celebrated again, and now condemned once more. Public opinion was meaningless, I told myself. What mattered was the truth, and I had the evidence to prove it. I called Patricia and told her to proceed with everything. File for recovery of the stolen inheritance. Prepare documentation for potential criminal charges. If Emily's in-laws wanted legal warfare, I'd give them exactly that. If I was going to be painted as the villain anyway, I might as well fight for what was rightfully mine. "Are you sure?" Patricia asked. "This will be brutal and you'll be doing it alone." "I've always done everything alone," I told her. "This is no different." But it felt different. Watching Ethan choose Emily. Watching him present a united front with the woman who'd destroyed my father's final wishes felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than my family's lifetime of neglect. He'd known the truth. He'd stood beside me as we uncovered every ugly secret. And still, when forced to choose, he'd chosen them over me. I resolved to proceed without him, without anyone the way I'd always known I'd have to. What I didn't know was that Ethan was playing a game I couldn't see, and the stakes were higher than I imagined. I was staying at my friend's apartment, sleeping poorly, and waking at every sound when I found the envelope. Someone had slipped it under the door sometime after midnight. Inside was a cheap, prepaid phone and a handwritten note on a torn piece of notebook paper. "Turn this on at midnight tomorrow. Trust me, E." I recognized Ethan's handwriting immediately, the same precise lettering from his brother's journal entry about Iron Widow. My first instinct was to throw both items away, to refuse to play whatever game this was. But curiosity and a desperate need to understand kept me from it. The next night I sat on the couch with the burner phone in my hand, watching the clock tick toward midnight. At exactly 12, the phone rang. I answered without speaking, and Ethan's voice came through, rushed and urgent. "I have 5 minutes before they'll notice I'm gone. Listen carefully. I didn't abandon you. I've been gathering evidence from the inside." He explained it all in a torrent of words. By staying close to Emily, by presenting a united front, he'd gained access to conversations and communications he never would have seen otherwise. He'd overheard phone calls between Emily's mother and their attorney discussions about whether there might be additional evidence they needed to locate and destroy. He'd found emails on Emily's laptop planning their legal strategy, including conversations about discrediting me by painting me as mentally unstable from military service. He'd been documenting everything, taking photos, recording conversations,